Hello, everyone, and welcome to the book launch for The Rise of the Infrastructure State, How U.S.-China Rivalry Shapes Politics and Place Worldwide, edited by Seth Schindler and Jessica DiCarlo. I'm not sure if you can see my copy here through the Zoom. This event is co-hosted by the Institute of Asian Research and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs here at the University of British Columbia. My name is Kristen Hopewell. I'm the Canada Research Chair in Global Policy here in the Policy School. And I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that the land on which UBC is situated and on which we're virtually gathering today is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So we're very fortunate today to have the two editors and three contributors to this extremely interesting and important volume here with us to discuss the book. It's my pleasure to introduce Jessica DiCarlo, who is a geographer and the Chevalier Postdoctoral Research Fellow in Transportation and Development in China, here in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. We also have Seth Schindler, who's a senior lecturer of urban development and transportation at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. And Jessica and Seth are the co-editors of the book and co-founders also of the Second Cold War Observatory, which I think they may say a word or two about in a minute. We also have Dinesh Paudel, an associate professor in the Sustainable Development Department at Appalachian State University. We have Charis, Enns, a presidential fellow in socio-environmental systems at the Global Development Institute, and Nick Jepson, who is the Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. And in addition to these editors and contributors to the book, we also have two graduate student discussants here today who are here to engage with the content of the book as well. We have Alyssa Brochu, who is a second-year MPPGA student, as well as Joy Yi, who's a visiting master's in public policy student from the National University of Singapore. So we have an exciting lineup of speakers and look forward to having the opportunity to engage with the book. So I'll start first by turning it over to Jessica DiCarlo for an introduction to the book.
Unmute myself. Can everyone see my slides okay? Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Kristen, for the introductions and for moderating for us today. And to everyone who's taken the time to join us, I'm really grateful to SPPGA and the Institute of Asian Research for their ongoing support and also for sponsoring this really exciting event for us. It's been a long time coming and a lot of editing and rewriting, and it's just very exciting to share this with the world. Thank you, of course, to Seth, my co-editor, and the authors for sharing their excellent research. And finally, thank you to my master's students, Alyssa and Joy, who prepared questions for us. So I'll kick us off and speak, I hope briefly, for about 10 minutes to give some context to my work, the volume, some of our key arguments and goals, and then I'll share the book structure, some chapters, before we get into more detailed discussions with our panelists. So my interest in this topic began really not from a geopolitical perspective, but from on the ground in China, where I've been working since 2008. And this perspective of living in China for several years and my curiosity on domestic issues and politics has really sparked the questions I've been working on around how China's been going out since the 1990s and how that's evolved with the Belt and Road Initiative. I recall being really puzzled by some of the narratives around the BRI about China taking over and these nefarious intentions with Beijing. And I really became interested in understanding China's global engagement from the ground in order to add more nuance and clarity to some of the narratives that we hear. So my more recent research takes an ethnographic approach and focuses on Chinese capital and development in border areas of Asia, particularly through infrastructure, which is where this book comes in. And this entry point really got me looking at the project level, not only at finance and bilateral relations, but the social and political dynamics and effects that concern people and decision makers on the ground. So my interest in this project was to challenge some of the China-US new Cold War rhetoric that we had been hearing. I'll talk more about that, while simultaneously acknowledging that this competition between China and the US is real and has effects on the ground. So through my fieldwork, I'm constantly reminded to look at projects in contexts, and that context involves not only the local and regional dynamics or orientations, but also the geopolitics that inform these other skills. So in the book, we're not really taking an IR perspective and looking solely at relations between states. Instead, what a lot of the chapters do is draw connections between the materialities and politics surrounding projects, state restructuring, which we'll talk more about, and how that connects to geopolitical competition. So a bit of background on this book. It's part of a broader project that's significantly evolved. It began in Beijing in 2019 at a workshop on the Belt and Road Initiative at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, where Seth, Dinesh, and I began conversations that eventually became a paper in Transactions, where we wrote about the infrastructure state and the notion of a new Cold War. At the time of the workshop, there was debate over whether the term New Cold War accurately described China-US tensions. Some called it a lazy analogy, and meanwhile, it rippled across headlines, and issues of foreign affairs and The Economist were dedicated to this new Cold War. There were plenty of problems with the term, so our point was not to say whether it was good or bad, and I find it really only became a useful shorthand because it snaps our thinking to bipolarity of tensions. However, as our discussions with each other and our colleagues evolved, we saw a need to move away from this bipolar narrative because it rarely actually held when you looked at projects more closely. However, with the Cold War frame kind of upfront in our conversations and thinking, we started to ask, on one hand, what can we learn from contemporary Cold War history and looking back at the Cold War, and also what was different about it? So that question, what was different, is really what is the basis of this book. We argue that in the book that key to understanding China-US rivalry today is its territorial logic. And that logic is not about controlling territory, but rather a competition for centrality and about integrating territory. And we see this in various sectors, such as production networks, infrastructure, technology, et cetera. And we're working on this in other places, but this book, of course, really focuses on infrastructure. So the second concept I want to highlight is our main one, which is the infrastructure state. Many chapters show how the territorial logic I mentioned allows states to pursue spatial objectives. And here I mean development and infrastructure projects to integrate territory. And that necessitates some level of state restructuring. And this gives rise to what we call the infrastructure state. So in my work in Laos, for example, government bureaucracies are restructured to pursue construction of the Lao-China Railway and to maintain their electrical grid through a public-private partnership. In many of the other chapters, governments have considerable agency in shaping their territorial designs, their transnational commitments, while in other countries, a host of middle and regional powers have actively expanded their participation in infrastructure sectors. So in this way, several chapters really challenge the bipolar nature of New Cold War rhetoric, and others point to historical precursors that kind of nuance our understanding of contemporary China-US competition. Something that I personally really love about the compilation is that each chapter demonstrates how the infrastructure state takes shape and affects places and people very uniquely based on the contexts and power dynamics within where these spatial objectives and projects are pursued. So this, I find, will actually be very key for research that accounts for how truly enmeshed our world is and for complexity on the ground. Indeed, as we've all discussed many times, the world imagined in these international offices in DC and Beijing doesn't always define life for people on the ground or decisions that are made in other countries. And yet these visions have effects as well. So to put some empirics behind this, I want to turn to the excellent contributions in this volume. The chapters are country cases that offer multi-scale analysis surrounding particular infrastructures, so roads and railways, economic zones, mining infrastructures, and even cities. And the book's divided into 3 sections that are primarily grouped on scale. And to get a scope of the volume, we begin, for example, in local offices of bureaucrats in Tanzania, which Charis will share today. And then we end with a chapter on outer space infrastructures. So we are all over the map in a sense. I really wish we could showcase every single chapter here today, but I'll just highlight a few in each section so you get an idea of what these sections are about. So part 1 takes us to the ground where projects are implemented. For example, we have an anthropological view on roads in Kyrgyzstan that show how local politics are driving projects just as much, if not more, than geopolitics. And the authors think about the debt trap meme that's been circulating and consider how instead amassing debt around projects actually acts as an investment in socio-political relations. In another chapter, Dorothy Tang offers a meticulous historical view of the design and planning of Japanese and Chinese economic zones in Lusaka, looking at competing state interests and unsettling notions of Chinese hegemony in the region. The second section zooms out to examine national politics, and many chapters focus on instances of state restructuring, building on Neil Brenner's work. So I've contributed a chapter on Laos to this section, really trying to pay attention to the dialectic of infrastructure investment and internal state restructuring, as well as power relations with other regional actors such as Vietnam and Japan. In the Philippines, similarly, Alvin Camba, Cruz, and Lim show that elites leaned on Chinese capital to produce contradictory projects. The Philippine Navy and Coast Guard at the same time exploit US-China competition with contrasting ends. And also in this section, a more historical view, Meredith de Boom takes us to Namibia and really traces the longue durée of uranium mining to evaluate what she calls radioactive strategies of successive local governments that are based on entanglements with both foreign states and mining companies. And we'll hear more from this section from Nick Jepson. In our final section on, this is more geopolitical, it again zooms out. We're looking at cases that where we see host states exhibiting agency as they hedge between either superpowers or regional powers to pursue projects and spatial objectives. So for example, Jessica Liao tells a very compelling story of Vietnam's hedging between Chinese and Japanese economic statecraft since the 1990s. Nearby in Indonesia, we learn how through Japan and China, Jakarta is attempting to remain aloof from US-China rivalry. And this occurs terrestrially as the government pits bidders against each other for high-speed rail contracts and also with maritime objectives. And in the final chapter, Julie Klinger shows through several contexts in Central Eurasia how infrastructuring space is itself a spatial project undertaken by coalitions that are public, private, and extend well beyond the US and China. So the sections are separated by interludes that engage with themes throughout the book. For example, Chung Chui Quick follows the thread of host country agency that runs through many chapters, and Stephen Rolfe considers whether a Sinocentric transnationalist class is emerging. All of these chapters really try to demonstrate this complex interplay between domestic politics and foreign policy while showing how projects actually unfold on the ground. In the conclusion, we try to situate contemporary rivalry within looking at the last competition of this magnitude, the Cold War, and how this led to the emergence of an emancipatory anti-imperialist politics. We ask whether it's conceivable for the current round of geopolitical contestation to give rise to some sort of 21st century third worldism. So with that very quick summary of our book, I want to turn to the panelists who are going to share the really rich details of their chapters. Charis will kick us off in Tanzania in the Central Corridor. Nick Jepson will show how the US and China have been drawn into domestic rivalries in Ecuador. And finally, Dinesh Paudel and Catherine Rankin's chapter will take us to the Himalaya, where they trace histories of infrastructure competition in Nepal to argue that the current crisis is really offering an opportunity to assert their own agenda. With all of this in mind, we'll end with Seth, who will take us to the conclusion of the book, which I mentioned, and also offer his thoughts on moving forward. As Kristen mentioned, we have, since working on this book, we've formed a collective of academics called the Observatory, or the Second Cold War Observatory, and I'll put a link in the group chat. Under this umbrella, we're trying to collaborate with each other, work on individual projects, and we even have some dissertations that are building on the ideas that are coming from this book. So you'll hear more about that toward the end. And thank you all for being here. Charis, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, are they showing okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, thanks so much, Jessica, and thanks for the introduction. So as was said, my name is Charis Enns, and I'm from the University of Manchester, and I'm presenting a chapter that was written with two colleagues, Brock Berseglio from the University of Birmingham and Masalo Luhula, who's now at Landesa in Tanzania. And when Jess and Seth originally introduced the idea behind this book to us, we found it interesting because the competitions that they were looking at and seeing at play were definitely evident in the places where we were doing research in Kenya and Tanzania at the time. But at the same time, at the scale where we were doing our work on the ground or in everyday spaces, these kind of geopolitical and geoeconomic competitions weren't as obvious on a day-to-day basis. So in our chapter, we explore why this is the case, and we argue that the infrastructural visions of national and global actors that shape mega infrastructure projects and East Africa's ongoing infrastructure scramble are never simply implemented as imagined or aspired towards on the ground. Instead, a range of different actors are at play to fill the gaps between project aspirations and on the ground realities. In our chapter, we're especially interested in the role played by local bureaucrats in adjusting top-down visions or ambitions for infrastructure to the local context, and how this results in infrastructures that take on a slightly different appearance or meaning in the process. And we find it interesting that these local bureaucrats that are often seen as not having much agency or say are actually able to make some pretty significant adjustments to these mega infrastructure projects that are being put forward or made possible by global powers. Our chapter draws on research that was carried out between 2017 and 2018 along the Central Corridor in Tanzania. So this is a corridor that runs from the east coast of Tanzania right through the center of the country and connects Tanzania to a number of other countries, Uganda, DRC, Rwanda, and Burundi. Although the Central Corridor is not new, a lot of the infrastructure along this corridor is dilapidated and requires upgrading. And the government's plan to revive this corridor in recent years has really been positioned as a way to make Tanzania an infrastructure hub or a transport hub, a place of physical intersection that will connect much of Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa, and East Africa to Tanzania's strategic ports along the Indian Ocean. So it's seen as a way to really create a new opportunity for Tanzania to be this transit hub for the rest of the continent. And the opportunities created by this transit hub strategy have not gone unnoticed by other actors, global actors, and this includes China. Chinese finance has played a really important role in reviving the Central Corridor, and Chinese enterprises have been at the forefront of winning a lot of the contracts that have brought this corridor to fruition. And while this is certainly because of a geoeconomic and geopolitical interest, like Jessica was saying about extending spatial or territorial control or access into Central Africa, there's also a clear geocultural agenda with this link. There's a long history of infrastructural cooperation between China and Tanzania, the Tazara Railway being the prime example, and this cooperation is based on shared socialist values. So with all this in mind, it's very much possible to see how the Central Corridor serves as an example of China attempting to extend or maintain hold of its geoeconomic, geopolitical, and geocultural interests in Tanzania and extend these into Central Africa through the Central Corridor. And you see these kind of competitions, or not competitions so much, you see these interests being extended and how they play out on the ground at play when you travel along the corridor. So this is a Chinese work camp, and you definitely see interactions between Chinese construction workers and everyday people, negotiations that are going on to bring projects to a reality. But at the same time, these aren't the types of competitions that are most evident on a day-to-day basis. Instead, a lot of the negotiations that happen to bring these infrastructure projects from plans to a reality are happening between local bureaucrats and everyday people. So they're happening at a very local level. And so we are arguing in a chapter that this happens because when massive infrastructure investments, even those that carry these really grand geoeconomic and geopolitical ambitions, hit the ground, they need to be translated and articulated at the local level in a way that works for everyday people. And we provide a number of different examples in our chapter about how this happens, how local bureaucrats take these projects and make them fit or work in the local context. But just to give you one example, one way that this has happened is by adding on new economic projects or new economic ambitions to these prepackaged corridor projects so that they work better locally. So the grand ambitions built into the Central Corridor of rapid international connectivity are not necessarily appealing or convincing to the everyday average Tanzanian citizen. They definitely don't sell the project enough for people to accept it cutting through their villages. The transnational multimodal infrastructure that comes with this corridor does very little for the average person. The railway projects that it comes with have high tariffs, and the stations are spread apart. And the large motorways are built for lorries, and they do little for people that are working small plots of land that only produce crops for subsistence purposes. These large multimodal transport networks aren't really going to do much for them on a day-to-day basis. So in response to pushback against what this infrastructure corridor offers everyday people, local bureaucrats have come up with new strategies to sell these projects as something that could work for them or could be worthwhile for them. And one example we provide in the chapter is how local bureaucrats have affixed local transportation services to this large corridor project. They've used district level funds to construct last mile infrastructure. So this includes bus stops, car parks, rest stops for lorries. And they've made this ambition or plan to become a main stopover point for freight moving between West and East Africa. In addition to providing these stopover points, transport services, opportunities to fix broken down vehicles, they've positioned themselves as an opportunity to create jobs for people as well. So there's income generating activities and jobs that comes with attaching these local transport services to the mega infrastructure corridor. And in doing this, they've physically adapted what the infrastructure corridor looks like itself. They've created a new rest stop, a new area where all the transport is meant to stop and contribute to these villages' economies. But they've also made the vision of this infrastructure corridor work for their local citizens. They've made it have value for their local citizens. So in the chapter, we argue that by adapting visions of infrastructure and managing what could be contentious relationships, what could be local or everyday citizens rejecting infrastructure, local bureaucrats contribute to ultimately upholding grand visions for infrastructure that circulate at the global level. And with each effort to adjust the central corridor to better align with the experiences and realities of ordinary citizens within their jurisdictions, district officers help to ensure that the corridor is seen as legitimate by those who they govern. Moreover, by managing and mediating complaints from their citizens about corridor design and construction, bureaucrats diminish the chance of conflict escalation, which could threaten to stall or block the infrastructure project from proceeding. In this sense, local bureaucrats participate in mediating the infrastructure state by taking visions for infrastructural connectivity designed by high-level actors from faraway places and translating them into a local vernacular that gives the project meaning and therefore aids in their implementation. These acts of mediation simultaneously add legitimacy to grand visions for corridor projects. So I'll wrap up there. Just our final kind of takeaways that local bureaucrats play this really integral role in shaping the contours of East Africa's infrastructure scramble. And their offices in particular are places where global competitions are being negotiated. Thank you again for letting me participate. This has been a really fun project to be involved in. Oh, and I guess should I pass it over to Nick?
Thanks very much for that. And yeah, thanks for organizing the event. And I guess I don't think I've actually said this to them. So congratulations to Jessica and Seth for putting this together. A fantastic volume and very pleased to play a small part in it. So I have a few slides. I'll try and share those. Let's see. Okay. So can you see that? Yeah. Okay, so I guess I'm sort of representing the section on state restructuring. I'm not going to kind of pretend to speak to all of that, but hopefully, you know, talking about the chapter that I've done on Ecuador can bring out some of the like larger themes in that section, and then we can talk about that a bit more in the discussion, perhaps. But to talk about Ecuador in particular, so what I was looking at is the particularly the presidency of Rafael Correa, who comes to power in 2007, in power for 10 years. sort of left populist Keynesian economist, part of this pink tide phenomenon in Latin America in the mid-2000s, comes to power with a very ambitious agenda, structural transformation, sort of a reassertion of economic sovereignty. That involves quite a thorough break with the US in some respects, in other respects not. Ecuador's a dollarized economy and is today still. For example, symbolic things like offering asylum in the London embassy to Julian Assange, but also throwing out a American military base on the Ecuadorian coast, things like this. Also particularly breaking with the IMF, with the World Bank, defaulting on debt to private creditors, making a break with capital markets, and also a big sort of infrastructure drive, particularly involving roads and dams. And as it says at the bottom there, a lot of that's bankrolled by borrowing lots of money from Chinese policy banks, and also the fact that Ecuador's an oil exporter going through the commodity boom of the time, and of course a lot of that's driven by Chinese demand itself too. So you have this kind of leftist sort of post-neoliberal agenda here, which however is rather contradictory. So it is an attempt to move beyond Ecuador's status as commodity exporter and extractive industry, using the revenues from extractivism to do that. So deepening of widening of the kind of extractive frontier, more oil production, including Chinese firms, more opening up of mining as well, very large copper and gold mine involving Chinese capital too, in the Amazon areas of the country particularly. So kind of contradictions here in various ways. How is this kind of carried out? Well, and to get to this sort of state restructuring parts, you have particularly the creation of this sort of super secretariat, this thing called Semplades, the National Secretariat for Planning and Development, which kind of stands above the line ministries, represents a kind of shift away from the kind of old way of the finance ministry being the kind of keynote of economic decision-making towards this new secretariat. Really, it's quite an interesting institution in that it's a kind of grab bag of kind of heterodox academics of different stripes. Within that, you get Marxists, you get developmentalists, neo-structuralists, post-developmentalists as well. And that, again, is one of these features of the sort of contradictory model that we get here, summed up in this idea of buen vivir, or something like living well in English. The idea that this will be the kind of animating concept for Ecuadorian development, replacing sort of rapacious capitalist development, respecting the rights of nature that's enshrined in the constitution, as are new rights for indigenous people. And yet this is an extractivist project that involves ripping up large parts of the Amazon. Quickly, Correa's government becomes embroiled in conflicts with indigenous groups particularly. The state extends in lots of other ways too, so public spending doubles, you get a slew of new public agencies, new state-owned enterprises, and that's managing this ambitious agenda, a lot of which is tied to infrastructure. So major road building program, and particularly big feature is dam building, and most of those dams are financed and constructed by Chinese firms. And the goal of this, really reflecting those kind of neo-structuralist elements within the new planning secretariat, is the idea of moving Ecuador away from dependence on oil domestically, meeting Ecuador's energy needs through hydroelectricity, in theory then lowering the price of that electricity and using that as launching pad for industrialization efforts, which are pretty halting really. In terms of actually generating the electricity, this is relatively successful. Lots of problems with the dams though, in terms of safety, people die, a couple of dozen people in construction, and also in terms of various corruption scandals and things that come later. But I think the most interesting project of the lot is this Yachay City of Knowledge. Correa calls this the most important project in Ecuador's history. It's dubbed Ecuador's Silicon Valley, kind of a mix of a planned city, university, a kind of tech cluster that sort of distills a lot of the ideology here and many of its contradictions. So this is sort of what it's meant to look at. And so you have different kind of sectors, you know, very ambitious things like devoted to biotechnology. So the idea of using the so-called genetic resources of the Amazon as a way to create new knowledge industries, these sorts of things, with the idea of moving Ecuador again from being a primary commodity exporter up to, you know, a knowledge industry exporter, these sorts of things. And then what really happens is this, essentially. So bits of it certainly are constructed. The Yachai Tech University is open today, had its first graduating class a few years ago. But as you can see, I think there's a fairly recent photo from this year. Lots of it's not constructed, and lots of it probably won't be constructed now. And to tell you sort of why, I mean, that's sort of postponed after the major earthquake in Ecuador caused a lot of damage in 2016. You get a downturn, economic downturn at the same time, just as Correa is leaving office. His vice president, Lenín Moreno, wins the election in 2017, and that presages a kind of unexpected shift to the right that's really a reflection of conflicts internally between sort of Moreno's faction and Correistas, and that involves also going back to the IMF, getting a new IMF deal, imposing a new sort of austerity agenda. Some of that is tied to the Odebrecht scandal, so this huge Brazilian construction firm that you know, collapses and scandal around this time, has impacts all over Latin America, and it develops this narrative where sort of large-scale public financed infrastructure is attacked as being inherently corrupt. Lots of supposed, well, in fact, real corruption scandals around some of the Chinese infrastructure as well. Correa's former vice president put in prison around this. And the idea of selling austerity is in fact an anti-corruption measure. So China and Chinese involvement getting kind of roped into this. 2021 election, kind of business figure and libertarian Guillermo Lasso narrowly wins election over a Correista candidate, Andrés Arauz, and then deepens many of these tendencies, of course. China is there to stay, however, you know, major trade partner, all this, but attempt to reconfigure the relationship around things like free trade agreements. Now, just to kind of finish off here, in terms of the kind of US coming back in, something that might be very significant is the US Development Finance Corporation, January 2021, kind of the waning days of the Trump administration, and also of Moreno's time, and in fact probably with the idea of tying the hands of whoever did win the election in Ecuador in 2021, signs this deal to pay off up to $3 billion of Ecuador's debts to China on the part of the US, and bring in a bunch of American investment as well, private investment, with the kind of quid pro quo saying Ecuador agrees not to borrow any more money from China, and also agrees to move away from Huawei telecoms networks. And this was seen as perhaps setting a precedent. I think, you know, the change of administration, particularly in the US, maybe has shifted this. Since I wrote the chapter, I had a look back, and doesn't seem like that many loans have come out of this. A little bit of SME lending, but that's it. But certainly an interesting sort of thing that might occur in future, points the way to how the if the US tries to exclude China from spaces, how this might work. And then just to say a little bit as well is that even though we have this kind of neoliberal restoration, as I've called it, we don't get a complete rollback to the 1990s. There is still this sort of infrastructure state there. It's a US aligned one now. And that means restructuring of different kinds. So that means things around opening up local capital markets, putting in the institutions to facilitate public-private partnerships, investment from abroad. You still get these 3 and 4 year national development plans, but now they're talking about the kind of familiar neoliberal script about attracting investment, about flexibilizing labor markets, all these kinds of things. And I will leave it there, but obviously happy to take up any of these themes in the discussion.
Great, thanks, Nick. So I think now we'll turn it over to Dinesh.
Okay, let me stop sharing here.
All right, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. I do not have slides, so I'll just talk. Sorry about that. I'm in a hotel room, but I'm here in Toronto for a conference. All right, thanks, Nick, for sharing that equatorial context. I think it's very similar how the details of infrastructure, how things are happening in Nepal. I'm talking about Nepal in the Himalayas a little bit. The book chapter is on that. By the way, really congratulations, a wonderful book, very well received already by all kinds of people. And it's really setting that tone, infrastructure and new Cold War as a new ground, and especially relevant and to the Himalayan situation. So it's really speak to that region very directly and very effectively. So congratulations and thanks for letting us be part of it. So there are two contexts that are very important to understand the Himalayan region. One, especially Nepal. One is this new Cold War. New Cold War in Nepal or the Himalayan region in general is becoming, it's manifested through infrastructure competition is the theme of the book, which we all know. But that competition has more details than, it's like the West versus East or US versus China. There are more details, and that are very important. So the details are like, there is India, there is Japan, there are these regional forces. Sometimes they work with the West when it comes to China, but they also are their own power. They want to create their own power centers. They want to create their own connectivity, their own market systems. They want to exercise their own geopolitical power and develop geopolitical infrastructure. These details really matter when it comes to countries like Nepal or Bhutan or other Himalayan countries. They have to not only deal with these larger geopolitical forces that that we see, but also these regional geopolitical forces. That makes things much more complicated and sometimes interesting for us as a scholar. That is one context. And the second context is that country like Nepal is moving away from traditional developmentalism, I call it, to more infrastructuralism. What do I mean by that is this very like this 70s, 80s style, very neoliberal, NGO-led, so-called empowerment-based, changing the mentality, thinking process of development to make them more civilized through, teaching, training, and all that, to that kind of subjectivity creation, to more infrastructure-based development, which is creating different kind of subjectivity and different path to subjugation. It's still subjugation, but different path to subjugation. That shift is happening in Nepal. That shift became so dramatic and powerful since 2015. In 2015, three events were very, very important. One was that the earthquake hit Nepal. It destroyed a lot of things, which required a lot of reconstruction. So development priority shifted from earlier kind of empowerment-based approach to more reconstruction-based approach internally. Second thing, that Nepal promulgated a new constitution, which gave them this idea that we are now settled the political problem. Now we have to go for economic prosperity. That became the new lexicon, new discourse in the country. And the third was that the new promulgation of new constitution was not really welcomed by India. So India imposed a kind of economic sanction to Nepal for 6-7 months. And that was a big thing because in Nepal is basically India-locked country, all right? So it gave new kind of dynamics, not only to domestic politics, but regional geopolitics. So in this context of these two things, one global new Cold War and another particular situation that emerged in Nepal, infrastructure became the kind of entry point to both domestic politics, but also regional politics. So in that context, Nepal started welcoming all kinds of international development effort. They are primarily infrastructure centric. And one of the main ones that really started that conversation in Nepal was the Belt and Road Initiative of China. China proposed kind of 5 main types of program. One of them was road connectivity between China and Nepal. Another was railway through the Himalayas. Extremely ambitious, but it already created new kind of debates and new understanding, new consciousness, new politics. Transmission lines, cyber connectivity, and economic corridors. They were like 5 main programs, Belt and Road Initiative, proposed to Nepal, and there are all kinds of development happening since then. The Belt and Road Initiative did one interesting thing that invited infrastructural competition in to Nepal. Then India came up with the counter BRI kind of projects to Nepal. 7 main kind of connectivity projects to Nepal. They widened the road. They have already more or less completed. 2 more railway lines to Nepal. They are working on it. A lot of economic kind of, what you call it, SEGs, special economic zones, right? I'm sure you all are familiar with that. So a lot of those things happening as a countering to these things, whereas Nepal invited both China, but also India, even though they all wanted to, propose those things to actually counter the other one. It was not only that. Japan came in and proposed all kinds of infrastructure development within the country. The first tunnel road is still under construction almost. They are completing it. It started in Nepal with Japanese assistance, getting that we are in it. We want to kind of create this kind of, infrastructure kind of competition in there. Not only that, USAID, US government, for the first time in its history of like 40, 50 years of development aid to Nepal, they came up with $500 million infrastructure project to Nepal, which is almost like unprecedented. There was never even thought about. So no, their primary donation to Nepal used to be education, human rights, these kinds of things. But $500 million boom for infrastructure project was like, it was a big surprise to Nepali people as well. Not only that, even the World Bank, which has kept its loan money to Nepal because Nepal is not very prosperous, developed, they don't have capacity to pay back, has increased that ceiling to provide more loans to Nepal so that they can invest in infrastructure. So all these regional and macro kind of power competition is started in Nepal through infrastructure. And the interesting part of that is that they all thought that they are the one who will be, influencing all infrastructure development projects in Nepal. They are all in different stages. Some are implemented, some are not. Sometimes some are kind of successful, none was always successful. Never. It never happens the way they plan. But the interesting thing is that they are all there in a different ways, different things, but they all want to minimize others' influence and increase theirs, right? It's a basic idea there. But the contemporary geopolitical understanding from both scholarship and practice is always that geopolitics are all about this macro political tension, and we also fail to acknowledge the fact that these so-called little places like Nepal and others, that they are simply the recipient of these power dynamics. We do not factor in their agency, their capacity, actually how they mobilize those global power tension in their benefit. Yes, Nepal is also the recipient countries. They have their own interest. They have their own differences and all those things. And these geopolitical power forces utilize those internal differences to mobilize their thing. But also these geopolitical forces are not very homogeneous as well. They have multiple interests. They are always fractured. They are not able to fully understand the locality ever. So they are also very weak in that sense. So Nepal, what me and Catherine Rankin, we try to demonstrate through the chapter and through other kind of writing, is that Nepal, in a very particular and very interesting way, has mobilized all these geopolitical kind of conditions to fulfill its own ambition and its own interest in very interesting and in very particular way. It's not, Nepal has demonstrated that Nepal is not simply the recipient of these fights, and Nepal is able to actually utilize them for its own benefit. So all these projects are in operation. No one is actually suppressing be able to replace other, but also some are successful and some are not. And it is not just because they were not interested in anything. It is how Nepal is implementing them, right? So it's a very, very kind of interesting way. So what the chapter is trying to demonstrate is that yes, there are these there is new Cold War, but new Cold War in the Himalaya is not as smooth and is linear. One might think it's much more complicated, complex, and no one actually has any hold in anything. Even though they all try, the local actors are powerful in so many ways too. They mobilize their even small communities. Sometimes they are not leaving their land and they are fighting that project. The project is failure just not because these big power holders do not have resources, capacity, or anything, but simple one community does not allow their land to be part of that highway. Done. The project is in limbo for several years. Right? There are multiple ways, the multiple subjectivity, multiple power, multiple materiality, the Himalayan slope, the landslide, the flood, climate change, everything operating in such a complex way to create this particular type of geopolitical tension through infrastructure in the Himalayas. So in conclusion, what I'm saying is that the Himalaya and the competition in infrastructure, geopolitics and competition in Nepal probably is a window to look at these much more complex and fraught tensions which are sometimes undermined in our understanding of geopolitics and geoeconomics. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And now we'll turn it to Seth to discuss some of the conclusions of the volume.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers, and good to see all of you and also the other contributors. It was a great pleasure to edit this book. I learned a lot. One of my main takeaways was that many countries are indeed able to pursue autonomous developmental visions, strategies, in this emergent multipolar world order, at least in comparison to the previous unipolar world order that preceded it. Time and again, countries do resist effectively, aligning either with the US or China exclusively, and instead they play them off against one another or hedge between them in the language of Cheng Chi-Kwik, one of the other contributors. So the last time that a similar situation prevailed was during the Cold War, when newly independent countries not only sought to safeguard their sovereignty and assert their right to self-determination, but they also acted in concert in an attempt to influence the international order. So Adom Getachew, in her book, World Making After Empire, makes this point very well. She says that she refers to these collective attempts to envision a more equitable world order as world making. So this kind of dynamic of asserting national sovereignty and also trying to foster some sort of new international order, more equitable one, is captured by Sukarno's opening speech of the 1955 Bandung Conference. I'll read you a quote that we cite in the conclusion. For many generations, our peoples have been the voiceless ones in the world. We have been the unregarded, the peoples for whom decisions were made by others whose interests were paramount, the people who lived in poverty and humiliation. Then our nations demanded, nay, fought for independence and achieved independence, and with that independence came responsibility. We have heavy responsibilities to ourselves and to the world and to the yet unborn generations. And what were these responsibilities that Sukarno was talking about? He names a few, but he says the one I'd focus on here is to inject the voice of reason into world affairs and mobilize all the spiritual, all the moral, all the political strength of Asia and Africa on the side of peace. So these politics that Sukarno outlined, these objectives, they were not particularly successful. And we can think of the non-aligned movement, but also third worldist movements, African Asian solidarity movements, and later the new international economic order attempts to kind of what Getachew calls world make, right? However, I think they really did animate a politics of hope throughout the long 1960s. And we can draw on Jeffrey Byrne's book, who I believe is a colleague of yours in UBC, a historian, entitled Mecca of Revolution. We do so in the conclusion of the book. Jeffrey illustrates many of the complexities of the era for post-colonial societies. So again, the focus is on Algeria. Ahmed Ben Bella was the post-colonial leader, or the leader of free Algeria. And he had to walk this diplomatic tightrope, as Bern explains in the book. Algeria at the time was receiving grain shipments from the United States, aid from France, aid from the Soviet Union and military supplies, and also maintained a cordial relationship with China. There were trade-offs, of course, in all of this. So, for example, Ben Bella was on the one hand committed to world peace in alignment with the vision outlined by Sukarno. On the other hand, he was equally committed to seeing the end of white minority rule in Southern Africa. And so this was immediately contradictory, of course, and he supported many revolutionary movements. His support for anti-imperialist groups led Algiers, the capital, to become a hotbed of revolutionary activity. So in addition to groups from anti-imperialist groups and revolutionary groups from across Africa, there were all sorts of other revolutionary movements that had a presence there, from Palestine, Vietnam, and even the Black Panthers. So Ben Bella was ousted prior to before the follow-up meeting to Bandung could be held. And if you want to know the details, I do urge you to read the book. It's excellent, Jeffrey Bern's book. But still, this raises a question then for us. Obviously, there's no such place comparable to Algiers as a Mecca of revolution. But what about world making? Is there any comparable place today that we could call a Mecca of world making in this emergent multipolar order? Sadly, my answer, and we conclude tentatively in the chapter, but my answer is no. While states do seem to be able to pursue autonomous developmental strategies in the context of this emerging and growing US-China rivalry, I see little evidence that there is any serious collective attempt at world making. Now, we wouldn't expect the United States to pursue such an endeavor, but what about China? And this, I think, is quite interesting. So for all of the talk in Washington of China as a revisionist power, it's hard for me to see what Beijing really seeks to revise, other than its place in the international order vis-a-vis the United States. This is, of course, a major departure from the long 1960s, when China practiced revolutionary evangelism, in the words of Matthew Galway. This is what historians currently write about as a global Maoism. And it seems to me that in that period, in the global Maoist period, China supported revolutionary movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And by contrast, what we might refer to today, and what some scholars refer to as global China, prefers bilateral ties with governments, right? So think of perhaps, there are a number of forums we could consider, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization might be one. I don't see that as a kind of world making. Instead, it's heavy on sovereignty, but light on world making, if we think in to choose terms. Elsewhere, we might think in terms of think about the BRICS. In a recently published article in Global Policy Journal, Robert Wade was cautiously optimistic about the ability of the BRICS to refashion a more equitable international order, while he at the same time acknowledged that the achievements of BRICS countries to do so to date have been few and far between. However, the very things that he outlines to me are, once again, I would put them more in that national sovereignty category rather than world making. I think it's difficult to envision a politics of hope around voting shares in the IMF. This reform may indeed be consequential for people around the world if that happens, and it may indeed even undermine the hegemony of Bretton Woods institutions. But I think the absence of hegemony is very different, in my view, from a more constructive and proactive construction of some sort of novel international institutions or novel international order. And that's what I at present don't see. So I think I'll end there on that slightly pessimistic note, and open for criticism on that point as well. So thank you very much.